This paper is a part of my PhD thesis on law, emotions, and feminism, working through the legal unconscious, where I'm exploring the interaction of law and emotions and questioning the predominant view of law as a domain of pure reason. I'm attempting to argue for a complex theory of law amenable to feminist politics that takes the question of psyche seriously. I'll not be reading my paper, which is a working draft, so I'd really appreciate your critical comments. In the beginning, I want to thank Dr. Ashton for giving me very good and very critical and sharp feedback, which I'm going to incorporate in my later revisions of the paper. So here, Martha Nussbaum is my primary interlocutor on account of her extensive work on emotions in law, especially disgust and shame in Hiding from Humanity, one of her earlier books, and more recently Anger in the 2016 Anger and the book on anger and forgiveness. Now she provides for a cognitivist evaluative framework for conceptualizing emotions, according to which emotions always involve appraisals or evaluations, and that she argues that the reason-emotion binary is false. Therefore, every emotion, according to her, has a distinct cognitive content. In case of anger, the desire for payback is what is central to it, according to Nussbaum. The desire for payback, she argues, is based on a magical fantasy that striking back would restore the lost object or effectuate a reversal of relative positions between the victim and the wrongdoer, which she calls the status injury. Now, both these ideas are normatively problematic, according to her, and therefore a sane, rational, mature, adult person, all her words, would leave anger behind and in a forward-looking way move towards what she calls transition in her book with a capital T. I just want to start by saying that her normative position on emotions and law is marked by a tyranny of shoulds. And I take this expression from psychoanalyst Stephen Gross, who's basically, from her book where he's actually documenting his case studies. By this expression, tyranny of shoulds, I mean that her work is actually about prescriptive commands of change and thought transformation, which she, and in the context of anger, she says, through transition, we should do that. This process of transition takes us towards compassionate hope in a future which is more constructive. So all through her work, she has maintained that law and legal doctrines are based on the evaluative conception of emotion. So there's a long piece that appeared in 1996 with Dan Kahn, where she was a co-author, where she evaluated all doctrines of criminal law, and she said criminal law also has internalized the evaluative conception of emotion. And her argument is that over time, law's evaluations of emotions change with the changes in the norms of the social. In this regard, specifically referring to the exception of provocation, she says that law has internalized her critique of anger. So the way provocation appears in the law is in consonance with her position of anger. So in other words, she says, see, law also does not tolerate anger after the cooling down period and only sees it as a partial excuse and not a complete defense. So even law normatively rejects anger. So I will not rehearse all the arguments made by Nussbaum here, but I'll move on to set out the limits of Nussbaum's liberal understandings of emotions, law, as well as the legal subject. So in her work, the discussion of emotions remains constricted to the emotions of a rational subject. In discarding the mechanistic conception of emotions and viewing emotions in evaluative terms, reason, control, and desire for certainty become paramount in her analysis, both in terms of the meaning of emotions as well as the subject of emotions. Now, to say, I have X emotion presumes a subject who always knows how she feels, a self-present subject in control, all-knowing, rational, and calculating individual responsible for all her actions, and she can actually make a choice between different emotional states. The image of a self-present subject irons out the complex workings of the mind. Even when the conscious rational self might be suggesting a particular course, the unconscious unconscious might conjure up its own varied parts. As Jacqueline Rose reminds us, there are possibilities in our unconscious minds that we would prefer not even sometimes to dream of. What one asserts in language may be totally incommensurable and radically unfit with what the unconscious seems to be hinting at. Thus, by merely describing the content of anger as one based on magical thinking, again Nussbaum's word, the hope that reason can prevail over it and one can move from anger to non-anger may be wishful thinking. It evades the foundational psychoanalytic truth that one does not give up on magical thinking even if one knows it is illusionary. In fact, illusions are held on to more dearly because they are illusions. David Caudle has also pointed out that the subject is not marked by an outside-inside distinction, so everything, including desire, language, the social law, they all are involved in the constitution of the subject. While the subject may appear unified, and the subject appears unified in legal theory, she's actually split. So subject is not external to, but inherently tied to the social structure. There's neither a unified ego in control, as Nussbaum's analysis suggests, nor a simplistic conscious-unconscious division. The subject instead is a network of relation of needs and demands with many others, including the family, friends, colleagues, your bosses, analysts, and the big other, which is the space of the social order and the rules of discourse that we internalize. So ego does not master its environment, it is rather captured by the system of laws, and laws of family, laws of community, laws of the state. It is the outside within us that gives us identity and purpose through science and social practices. We may get an idealized image, a misrecognition of autonomy and freedom, but that is now not how it is. In other words, the social network is not to be seen as an outside to which the subject submits. It is instead internalized by the subject very early on in life. Now, if the outside within us gives us identity, the separation of psychic from the political becomes unsustainable. However, the chief characteristic of Nussbaum's subject is a distinction and separation from the social, political, and the legal. The subject, despite her internal strife and rage, can prevail over the legal and political institutions because she's outside and independent of the social and the legal. Consider her statement in her recent book where she says, and I quote, "Even if people don't work hard on or even perhaps embark on personal self-cultivation, however, it seems simply inexcusable to tolerate or even encourage political and legal institutions that embrace and valorize the stupidity, she says, of the retributive spirit. Our institutions should model our best selves, not our worst. They should exemplify adulthood, even if we are often children. Even if every single person continues to nourish personally a degree of irrational retributivism, we should not tolerate stupidity in systems of law and justice," unquote. Here the suggestion is that while people may continue to harbor irrational retributivism, they should still resist the retributive spirit in political and legal institutions. But my point is that the retributive psyche of people does not exist outside or prior to the political and legal institutions. The psyche and political are not separate realms. Instead, how you see yourself psychically and then how you engage with the political, what you do politically, these two are absolutely inseparable. Further, I contend that her liberal proposition is not merely premised on the misplaced assumption that the psyche and political are separate realms, but also on a simplistic view of agency and resistance. Agency is not just a state of being. It is a difficult state of becoming where the possibility of political freedom from retributive spirit is tied to psychic freedom from anger. In Nussbaum's normative account against anger, there's a call for political resistance without acknowledging the blockages in the psyche that resist any progressive change. Therefore, the objective of, she says, getting the readers to see clearly the irrationality and stupidity of anger and then getting them to abjure anger from political institutions is made out extremely easy, ironing out the resistance offered by our mind in this process. Political resistance requires seeing clearly, but this clarity of vision is often impeded by psychic resistance. Psychic resistance is internal to the self, often not progressive, and in fact, it inhibits change. Again, as Jacqueline Rose points out in her book, The Last Resistance, and I quote her, if in political vocabularies, resistance is the passage to freedom, for psychoanalysis it is repetition, blockage, blind obeisance to crushing internal constraint. Resistance in political terms is conscious, and it is focused for change, but psychoanalytically, resistance is inimical to change. And unless this dual meaning of resistance is accounted for, the normative argument will only be burdened with the tyrannical prescriptive commands. In other words, it is impossible to attain political goals and legal reforms if the mind is warring against itself. And in completely ignoring the resistance of the psyche in building normativity, what we have is a conception of a subject who is or ought to be in complete control of a consciousness, a rational subject of law, who is ready to take on the world with her reasonableness. Now, and this subject is already aware of what is the right thing and would choose to do the right thing. She would recognize and brush aside the magical thinking and act in the way she should. My argument basically is that agency and the possibility of ensuing resistance to aggressive passions need to be theorized based on a much more complex notion of the subject as internally divided, unstable, fractured, and with an unconscious. Only then we can think of rupturing the certainty that takes over the normative mode of thinking, writing, and practicing. Am I speaking too fast?
No.
Okay. Now, so I move to the next argument there, which I'm going to elaborate through a case study. So now in Nussbaum's work, despite years of critique by critical scholars as well as post-colonial legal theorists, the legitimacy and the authority of law rests in its normativity. But as I've tried to argue about, the legal is a space which is informed and constituted by the social. So the retributive sentiments form the basis for the legal infliction of pain, even though law would like to self-present itself as cool and clinical and calm. The case that I want to draw upon is a case of provocation. In fact, Professor Pandey mentioned it in the morning. It's V.D. Kunte versus Union of India. This involves V.D. Kunte, who was a soldier, a Jawan in the Indian Army, and he was convicted and sentenced for murder of his superior officer, Subedar Randhir Singh. Kunte preferred an appeal against his conviction before the Supreme Court, challenging the conviction for murder and seeking the exception of provocation. Now, defense of provocation under the Indian Penal Code has this twin requirement. You know, it must be great, it must be sudden, and by sudden, it means that there must be no cooling down period. And this provocation must have caused the loss of power of self-control. It may be noted that the law of provocation in India includes, from the very beginning, has included the concept of cumulative provocation, where even after the cooling down period, the exception can be claimed if the subsequent conduct of the deceased ignites the initial provocation. Now, I just want to start briefly by reading out Kunte's own account of the incidents that led to the killing. So he says, on 28 June 2006, I was resting in my bunk after lunch when the deceased Subedar Randhir Singh came to my cot in an inebriated state, slapped me mildly twice and asked me to follow him. Thinking that I was being called for some kind of duty, I followed the Subedar to the storeroom, where he bolted the door from inside and asked me to remove my pants, suggesting thereby that he intended to sodomize me. When I declined, the Subedar punched me and kicked me repeatedly and asked me to put my hand and hold the side beams of the top berth of the bunk in the storeroom. While this was going on, two other personnel knocked at the door of the room, but the Subedar opened the storeroom and asked them to go away and continued my torture for half an hour. I somehow managed to free myself and return back, shaken and crying inconsolably. I shared my grief and sorrow about the whole episode with my colleagues and immediate superior officers, but no formal complaint was lodged by the superior officers against the Subedar. The officers pacified and advised me to remain calm and keep my cool. My colleagues later on planned to gather near the water heating point to beat up the Subedar. And he just goes on to say that this plan could not be executed, and later in the night when he was on night duty, the Subedar approached him and, and at that point in time, he shot him. So there was a gap of a couple of hours between the killing and the alleged sodomy. Now, in the light of this above account, Kunte's counsel argued that even though there was a gap of several hours between the attempted sodomy and the killing, Kunte had not cooled down and had been all the while seething with anger. On the other hand, the Union of India, who was representing the deceased as well as the army, contended that a long interval had lapsed between the alleged provocation by the deceased and the murderous assault by the appellant. The court conceded that an incident did take place in the storeroom, since the appellant was seen crying by many of his colleagues, and he had reported to them, and I quote, "Sahab beat me up and asked me to open my pant. On my refusal to do so, he beat me again." However, by looking at all this account, the court made a distinction between the attempt at sodomy and the actual fact of sodomy, and observed that there is no clear evidence that the deceased had actually sodomized him, and then goes on to say whether or not the deceased had sodomized the appellant is not material at all. The extent to which the court believed the appellant was that he was beaten and he was humiliated by the superior officer. So the court rejected the plea of the appellant and said that the deceased had not come close to him or tried to act fresh with him so as to give the appellant another provocation that could possibly justify his losing self-control and using his weapon. Moreover, the deceased at any rate could not be accused of having given any provocation to the appellant by moving towards the place where the appellant was on guard duty, for the deceased was well within the sphere of his duty to keep an eye on those who were performing the guard duty. Now, it is really interesting to see, and I'm going on with this account because in her book, Nussbaum actually says that law's position on provocation is consistent with my normative account on anger. So, and law concedes to that position. That's why, this account I'm drawing. So what is interesting to note, with a close reading of the case is that how the court continues to operate within this framework of duty. The Subedar, they say, was within the sphere of duty despite the physical assault and humiliation that he had subjected the appellant. Even after attempting sodomy in the afternoon, the Subedar continues to claim the right to keep an eye on those who were performing the guard duty. It was Kunte who violated the norms of duty through his retaliation. The state read Kunte's response as retaliative and retributive, in Nussbaum's version, unacceptable payback anger, and thus not deserving of mitigation of culpability. He should have kept his faith in law and let the law take its own course. Since he did not behave like a reasonable person who would not obsess about anger, he failed to live up to the normative expectations of law. However, such construction of Kunte's response, unreasonable criminal rage, is possible only by effacing the institutional apathy towards his complaint. He was asked to remain calm and keep cool when he complained about the incident. In this context, I would like to pose this question: that can we see Kunte's anger as an outlaw emotion, or what Alison Jaggar calls an outlaw emotion, in a deeply hierarchized and closed institution of the armed forces? Is it Kunte's violent response and expression that subverts the dominant institutional norms marked by the uncritical obedience of superiors' orders and the silence and secrecy around the internal workings of the armed forces? Outlaw emotions, according to Alison Jaggar, provide the first indications that something is wrong with the way alleged facts have been constructed with accepted understandings of how things are. Only when we reflect on our initial puzzling anger or fear may we bring to consciousness our gut level awareness that we are in a state of coercion, cruelty, injustice, or even danger. So Kunte's anger, in this sense, I'm reading as a rejection of the culture of silence that expected him to remain calm. In his defense, Kunte's lawyer had argued that the incident of this nature, that is sodomy, takes place in the army very usually, but it is underplayed by the authorities by either denying the same totally or presenting a different picture which is neither true nor realistic. Not surprisingly, no part of the reasoned order of the court makes any reference to this assertion. In the way the court proceeds in its legal reasoning, there is not only a denial of the truth of Kunte's testimony, but a complete suppression of such violence internal to the logic of the armed forces across the world. Euphemistic descriptions of the violation as misdemeanor and humiliation, these are words that I use, have been used as linguistic strategies to maintain the known quality of the obscene side of the armed forces. The myth of honor has to stay intact, and that is why there's such a refusal to see the unconscious, even when it spills out. While the armed forces often rightly, and they should, they rightly come under critical scanner for the excesses externally committed by them on civilians, prisoners of war, women, when they are operating in war zones and conflict areas, the excesses that produce the disciplined soldier and that create the subjectivity of the soldier through years of tormenting physical, mental, and emotional training, traumatic training, go unaddressed and unattended. The logic of the severity of the training and the ethos on which it is premised are never questioned. Making of a soldier is a psychological exercise of ridding them of the wrong emotions and breeding the right ones. The right emotional character forms the ethos of the army. And if you go on the Indian Army website, they have been told that this is what you're supposed to do, and this is how they should not act. So humiliation in the training process is actually a way through which camaraderie is built in armed forces. The psychic abuse inherent in the training regimes aims to induce a psychological regression that infantilizes the subject and causes a loss of autonomy to remake their character through suggestions to which they will be more receptive now, through which they will start obeying the superior orders. It is through this kind of infantilizing that the army constructs that masculinity which is ready to kill. The impunity of the violence of the armed forces is not difficult to explain in this context because the violations are committed not by the enemy other, whom it is fairly easy to despise, but by the institution that constructs its self-image through collective national pride. Truth is buried through denial, and even when violence is acknowledged, it is often seen as an exception or an aberration, so that the founding faith and allegiance to the Constitution and the values it stands for remain intact. The erasure of sexual violence marked by the Supreme Court in this case is symptomatic of the fact that the judiciary works with the state to keep the official secret of the violence that lies in the foundation of nations and nationalisms. The complicity of the judiciary, the ultimate guarantor and protector of human rights, with the official state is in the service of rule of law that binds all state institutions, especially the state forces that claim to protect us from the enemy. It is important to reiterate that while the exception of provocation may not take into account all the cases of real momentary anger, and I've done 2 more cases in my paper of domestic violence victims, of cases of spousal killing, where not consistently wives have been given this defense. But the situations where the anger is an institutional emotion, that is when anger falls in line with the logic of social, cultural, and political institutions, and is in tune with the power-based interest, it would be accounted for. It is accounted for in the law. Nussbaum might not want the law to endorse honor or status-related areas, and therefore she argues that anger at diminished honor and status should not be given the defense of adequate provocation, but this desire emerges again from a liberal view of law and emotions where both exist outside and independent of the social. And we have such work on habeas corpus cases which has shown us that how honor and honor status notion and honor related to family, community, and nation, is what is upheld by the courts. So Kunte's case shows that emotions acquire specific meanings and legitimacy within larger institutional settings. Emotions' validity and desirability are tied to the institutions within which they circulate. So they're not independent, they're not outside these institutions. Emotions, perhaps this explains why male anger at loss of honor when their wives and daughters step out of bound of the familiar terrain is readily appreciated by the courts in most provocation cases. I mean, there's like dozens of cases of this nature where provocation is given, in honor-based crimes, when men go on to kill women. The institutional logic of family, marriage, community, and state construct the zones of permissible emotional expression. Kunte's expression of anger was unacceptable because it went out of bound in its expose of the internal violence of the armed forces. It will always be difficult to secure a place for such outlaw emotions within law, owing to law's own identification with the social and the political. This is the tragedy of Martha Nussbaum's normative stance on anger. It will outlaw subversive emotional outbursts, but will never manage to disrupt the institutionally sanctioned and privileged emotional scripts.
This is a working paper and still work in progress, and I would really like to seek criticism, comments on this paper from you. Ashley has already given some very devastating critique on my paper to me, and I'm thankful for that, and I'm trying to incorporate that to read my paper. I will read my paper because so that I can keep to time and I can be specific. The paper is already circulated, and you can have it, and you can read it for all the sources. This paper attempts to develop a critique of the argument of civilizational advancement as a plea for abolition of death penalty. Analyzing some recent literature on abolition of death penalty, I will argue that even the apparently sophisticated arguments of abolition endorse a civilizational thesis. Such an argument is premised on compelling of the non-Western nation state to climb up the evolutionary ladder and catch up with the progressive and civilized notions. I will argue that the civilizational thesis inadvertently reinstates the colonial ideology of evolutionary progressivism. I then discuss how it is the idea of the civilization itself, following Freud, which invents depressions that constitutes the psyche of the modern citizen subject. Finally, I take up the notion of psyche via Nietzsche to rupture the seamlessness of the subject of law. I use psychoanalysis to argue via Derrida that a meaningful opposition to death penalty has to institute a breaking of coherence of the legal subject and an acceptance of the unconscious that Nietzsche presages in his genealogy of morals. Only that can be a truly principled opposition, and we were talking about principled oppositions to death penalty. It is in this original spirit of Nietzsche that we imagine nihilism, nihilism not as something negative, but something like a critique, which is, as the old German sense, something which is to be productive. A critique which would give birth to or a search for a principled opposition of death penalty. A critique of the affects and effects associated with death penalty and punishment as such requires to dare to live in uncertainty and negate the codes of violence that form the fabric of the self. It is the analysis of the self or the psyche that can provide the beginnings to understand the malaise of the society. After all, as Peter Goodrich has reminded us, the social as a subject performs the mimesis of characteristics that are found in the individual subject. Collective identity is deemed to be just as phantasmatic, as driven by pleasure and pain, desire and fear, as a self-image of persona of the individual. As the Western legal tradition has long recognized, a nation is a system of simulations, and it acts as if it were a subject. A search for the opposition of death penalty, which is principled, cannot be unmindful of the fact that abolition cannot be just erasure from the statute book of the penalty of death. It can't be just the erasure of death penalty as a punishment. The fundamental insight of psychoanalysis is that no simplistic erasures are possible. The end of death penalty must also mean the prognosis and containment of the eruptions of drives and fears based on violent impulses or desires in individuals to cause death as murder, or in the social for death dealings such as war. This paper assumes critique as an ethical commitment which is beyond everyday calculations or transactional interests. The impetus for this paper comes from the work of Jacques Derrida, his seminars on death penalty, where he points to the notion of interest as opposed to opposition. So interested as opposed to a principled opposition. Interest as related to some kind of a calculation or search for profit. This may be either monetary, psychological, search for a greater well-being or a greater good, increase of enjoyment. In what follows, I'll begin to try to unpack the idea of the civilizational thesis. An opposition to death penalty invariably involves exposing the savagery and barbarism associated with the notion of death penalty. Those espousing for the cause of abolition have often taken recourse to this argument that death penalty is savage and barbaric. It is argued that the institutionally sanctioned way of putting an end to life is a remnant of a savage and bygone era. Xavier Yanez, for instance, arguing against death penalty in the US context, remarks, death penalty, I quote, should be abolished because it is a barbaric form of punishment which should not be allowed in the United States, which is supposedly one of the most civilized nations of the world. One cannot miss the emphasis on the most civilized as a characteristic marker for the United States. Death penalty must be abolished, so the argument runs, because the most civilized nation should not hold on to the form of penalty which forms the habitus of the barbaric and uncivilized parts of the world. The foundational assumption is that criminal law of civilized nation states does or should not have barbaric features. H.S. God, who is an authoritative writer on criminal law in India, in a similar vein denounces death penalty, saying that no civilized country today imposes such heavy sentences as the penal code does. Heavy sentences have long gone out of fashion in England, and the odor of sanctity and perfection attaching to the penal code should not deter indigenous legislature to thoroughly revise the sentences and bring them in conformity with the modern civilized standards. Despite the well-meaning intent, the unspoken motivations to catch up with the civilized world undermine the logic of abolition and reinforce the colonial Eurocentric ideology of your evolutionary progressivism. Michelle Miao, in her analysis of the Chinese legal framework in the context of Chinese death penalty, maps the transformation from cruel displays of taking lives in China to a relatively civilized approach. Her diction provides sanction for the necessarily coercive measures that may be taken in order to catch up with the civilized standards with respect to death penalty. She argues that South Asian states need to be informed, and I quote her, about the position of the other countries on capital punishment policies, and by forcing them to accept their status as rogue states in the international community, unquote. She further contends that exposing China's practices in the field of capital punishment to the global media discourse has forced China to rethink about its capital punishment policies and has made China to reconsider whether it should insist on its excessive capital punishment policies and whether such policies comport with China's self-perceived identity as a civilized nation and responsible member of the global community. It is important to pause and raise some questions about such formulations. Miao's argument rests on the idea that death penalty is a dent on the self-image of the so-called first world nations, or it is a reflection of the uncivilized character of nations belonging to the other worlds, which should now be on the roads towards civilization. A familial colonial framing exists in this formulation of movement from barbarism to civilization. The colonial experience has informed us of the pathologies intrinsic to the evolutionary discourse that draws a linear trajectory towards the progressive future. In the context of death penalty, this teleological movement is perceived as automatically towards the more civilized nations of society. What are the implications of this civilizational argument for non-European, not yet civilized nations? How, for instance, should one understand global media discourse that Miao talks about that has forced the Oriental other to reformulate their policies on capital punishment or accept their status as rogue state, which is an interesting expression we all know. In the same vein, she also mentions the Europe's self-perceived identity as a normative promoter of human rights values has found profound expression in the international pursuit of abolition of death penalty. Indeed, the mission to eradicate death penalty from the statute books is a part of European Union's foreign policy. The civilizational argument clearly envisages an anti-death penalty we, believing in the preservation of human life, as a form of penal evangelism. We who seek to solve the penal barbarianism and them who are the recipients of such efforts. This divides so deep in the pathologies of the colonial ideology that reinstates itself in a new form with all its force. Following Derrida, the civilizational argument is an argument of interest, something which strengthens the logic of the nation-state and nation-state rivalry, far from being an argument in principle against death penalty. This diagnosis of the interest in arguments of abolition is what, according to him, is needed in order to philosophically sharpen our understanding about the phenomenon of death penalty. One can well recall the concluding paragraph of seminar 6 on death penalty, where the imploration goes that we must broaden the analytic of interest to the social or national or state body and ask ourselves what interest a state, a nation state, or even a global state might have in maintaining or suspending capital punishment. Dissection of civilizational argument is in no way a suggestion to dilute the argument for abolition. Instead, the aim is to understand the unspoken and latent implications of the death penalty debate. This discussion must alert us not ever to be unmindful of the logic and justification of colonial violence. Both at the individual and social level, formations and formulations of sentiments come into play as and play an immense role in understanding the punishment, which is a part I'm moving that what is the role of this of civilization in creating a psyche, and what is the role of emotion or public sentiment and a catchy phrase, conscience of people in determining punishments. To illustrate, one has to glance how the majority in the Bachchan Singh famous judgment took recourse to the democratic sentiment of public in order to retain death penalty in exceptional cases. The Indian Supreme Court registered its dissent with the US court's Furman versus Georgia. One of the judges, Justice Sarkaria, speaking on behalf of 3 other judges, again accepted the standards of morality of the American people as a lesson for the Indian court. He pointed out, and I quote, Furman, the honorable judges claim to articulate the contemporary standards of morality among American people, but speaking through public referenda, polls and state legislature, the American people sharply rebuffed them. We must draw the lesson from the same. Evocation of public sentiment and democratic guiding factor as a democratic guiding factor for penal policy framed the judicial understanding regarding death penalty to a great extent. Such formulations replete the judicial canon in many other cases, even though at times it borders to the level of absurdity. Another important case of Machi Singh versus State on death penalty, the court referred to the community's collective conscience as an appropriate yardstick for infliction of death penalty. The community, the court said, would not impose death penalty in all cases. However, it would expect death sentence if the community's collective conscience is so shocked that it will expect the holders of judicial power center to inflict death penalty irrespective of their personal opinion. The notion of collective conscience also found its way in the infamous Parliament attack case. The Supreme Court justified the infliction of death sentence on Afzal Guru in the following terms. The incident which resulted in heavy casualties has shaken the entire nation, and the collective conscience of the society will only be satisfied if the capital punishment is awarded to the offender. And needless to say, the interests again, which we talk about, that obviously Afzal Guru being a non-Hindu, and Afzal Guru being somebody who's hanging, would also have the interest of the nation state, not to say the Hindu nation state. The passage in particular justifiably drew scathing criticism against the Supreme Court at various forums. However, as pointed out, neither such vacuous recourse to public sentiment in neither novel nor surprising given the history of judicial discourse on death penalty. Such remarks of collective conscience expose both the history and the unconscious of the judicial discourse on death penalty. It is this irrational and unconscious fear that is inextricably linked to the institution of punishment. The phenomenon of punishment becomes an outlet where such latent drives find their way out. Here, the relationship between increasingly security-oriented state and latent emotional impulses is equally important. That why do we want, or as someone said, why punishment pleases? Why is it so pleasing? And in this context, one has to investigate the contemporary fetish for the security and all kinds of penal brutalities sanctioned for security that Mrinal was talking about. In the infliction of death in cold blood, the society acquires a shape of the sovereign beast who kills in cold blood and rejoices the killing of an alter ego of the condemned. The civilized mask here gives way to hidden face of beastly aggression, which unleashes itself in the form of realization of sadistic fantasies. This gives a hint towards the understanding of enjoyment and festivity associated with punishment, which Friedrich Nietzsche so often talks about in his discussion on punishment. In fact, it's interesting to note how many times Nietzsche emphasizes in Genealogy of Morals about the festivity associated, the excessive enjoyment associated with punishment. The horror then lies in the fact, as Freud reminded us, that civilization annihilates its own creation. Judith Butler puts it succinctly: the other problem with civilization is that it seems actively to dismantle what it has built, to destroy what one brings into being. It takes aims at its own creation and attachment, pursuing a furtive vocation, repetitive unknowing that works in contrary direction to its forward-oriented tasks, and all conceits of progress. She goes on to read Freud in an overall context of death penalty and remarks, quoting her, Freud ends his Civilization and its discontents, remarking that civilization runs the risk of being undone by its own aggression. going so far as to voice his anxiety about the prospect of extermination. Killing then becomes, in this festive moment, a sport, a festivity or celebration in phantasmatic imagination, inaugurating the neoliberal violent subjectivity. The uniqueness of such imaginary violence is that the power score of the repressed violence that remain intact despite the outward appearance of humanized, civilized, and sanitized forms of punishment. So the argument being that this civilized sensibility on the outside has this deep underbelly and core of violent outbursts, which becomes a moment to celebrate and festively do. Gopal Gandhi, in his recent book on death penalty, comments on 3 recent executions in India, and he aptly illustrates the point. He says, and I quote him, that the executions could not be watched by public, but they were also closely followed in media as India-Pakistan cricket match would be. The pathology and complexity of analogic connection between human execution and cricket is at once opposite and troubling. This is the troubled core of the social unconscious, which can further find support in the discursive populistic governmental demands of preventive coercive measures in times of terror. One has to carefully analyze the entangled knot of unconscious desires and drives in their relationship with discursive fears of security to begin to understand the gap between public sentiment and criminal justice. What, after all, is the history of genealogy of this festive dimension of punishment? The legal subject imagines that the pleasure obtained by such infliction of suffering on the other provides a form of a recompense. So this violent of infliction is a kind of a compensation. Here I think Nietzsche presages the later distinction that psychoanalysis draws between pleasure and enjoyment. The pleasure attained by injured party is a strange pleasure. Injured party when it inflicts pain on the criminal, on the guilty. One may suspect that the pleasure as a right to inflict suffering is an excessive or surplus pleasure. It has to be excessive, Nietzsche's word, as actual recompense is an impossibility. You cannot have a compensation. So the pleasure derived is more than necessary, and ironically through counter pain inflicted on the offender. It is strange enough. An equivalence is provided by the creditors receiving in place of literal compensation for the injury. Thus, in place of money, land, possessions of any kind, a recompense in the form of kind of pleasure, the pleasure of being allowed to vent his power freely upon the one who is powerless. The voluptuous pleasure, Nietzsche describes, the enjoyment to violate, the enjoyment of violation. The compensation then consists in warrant for the title to cruelty, says Nietzsche. This is where Nietzsche inaugurates the principle of biopsychology, a notion of cruelty which ironically forms the foundation of legal common sense and the legal subject. It is in this context that Nietzsche accuses Kantian categorical imperative of jus talionis, the principle of equivalence, the proportionality of crime and punishment, as rooted in calculations and, more importantly, cruelty. Because how do you have jus talionis and proportionality when there is an impossibility at the heart of crime and punishment? The categorical imperative, argues Nietzsche, is on the same page. Smells of cruelty, and he says smells of cruelty. Nietzsche goes on to emphasize the birth of this peculiar phenomenon of institutionalized cruelty, though Nietzsche does not speak of it, finds it crescendo when it is epitomized in the peculiar institution of death penalty. To ask it again, and I'll leave that and I'll move on to my final point, Nietzsche, in sketching the genealogy of punishment, also points to the ironical reality of criminal law. When the criminal law punishes by infliction of pain on the guilty, it gives legitimacy to the impossible possibility of satisfaction by making the other suffer. So, a possibility which is actually impossible. Every act of punishing is also a reiteration of cruelty, reinstating the legal subjectivity that may embarrassingly develop into the collective conscience of the social, which ought to find an orgasmic satisfaction in making the other suffer. As if this satisfaction of criminal law resonates with the idea of enjoyment as superego injunction in psychoanalysis, it is a burden to enjoy, but a burden that one has to love or learn to love, to believe in cruelty as recompense. This is important, as this complexity forms the very core of criminal law. Therefore, any effort to wish away the desire for cruelty, the shoulds that Latika talk about, or drives of aggression as a rational choice are doomed to fail. One has to acknowledge that functional dimension of the law plays a part in construction of the aggressive forms of cruelty, which is proclaimed to eradicate through the same act which reinforces such drives. This ironical structure of law requires a psychoanalysis of the latent self which is hidden. This is how I understand and fully reiterate the Foucauldian claim that Enlightenment categories of progress or humanism are just not adequate for totally understand the normative structure of the law. The fact that policy pronouncement which attempts to cash and carry type of reforms are doomed to mirror the endless cycle of Sisyphean labors, which would end up circular, repetitive mythological wheel, which we talk about. And I'll skip my paper and just to come to the last part, that we need to diagnose the self of the law and the citizen subject to realize its deep roots in cruelty, which I am talking about. Reinforced by the everydayness of the legal decision making. This is the everydayness of the law, this is the everydayness of the common sense that we are supposed to believe, we are supposed to imbibe, we are supposed to, it should be embedded in the psyche. This has to be put in analysis so as to begin the task of reformulation of a social without reproducing the circles of violence. We must realize that the task at hand of rethinking the criminal law through a discussion on death penalty requires psychoanalysis as much as it requires a closer understanding of theology. A reform proposal for crime and punishment which fails to see cruelty reproduced in individual psyche and as a social norm in every pronouncement of criminal law is doomed to be a new civilized proposal for repression. And as we are told in the Lacanian reformulation of the Freudian notion of repression, whatever is refused in the symbolic order, in the sense of foreclosure, reappears in the real. Thank you.
Okay, and then finally, Craig is going to talk on psychoanalysis and penalty.
Okay, thank you. Both for two extremely rich papers. I'm looking forward to the discussions after this session. The two papers that we've just had really helped me out as well in, they've filled my head with questions, which doesn't help me out, but also it does help me out in terms of having said a lot of the things that I wanted to say in the early part of my paper, so I can skip that and go to the bit that that moves a bit beyond what you've said about the sadistic side of penalty. So on the one hand, I want to agree with a lot of what you said about the sort of Nietzschean version of the Freudian story about punishment. There's a number of different sort of versions of this paper with different titles. One of them is What Punishment Expresses. One of them is Love and the Possibility of Justice. So you can tell that I'm not very sure what the emphasis. I'm torn. So on the one hand, I want to sort of agree with a lot of what's just been said about the sadistic aspect of punishment's expressive content. But I want to also see if I can say, I want to ask a question about the expressive content of the particular concrete forms of hard treatment. When we read a lot of this literature about punishment is, there's some really good stuff, but I want to sort of raise a question about the historically changing forms of hard treatment, and what I suppose I'm going to be talking about defences or unconscious processes that might be played out in those. And I also want to try to see if there's something a bit more optimistic than the sadistic Nietzschean Freudian story going on in the history of penality as well, as a potential at least. And the way that I want to approach this, basically I want to take a particular psychoanalytic account in what's known as the British tradition of psychoanalysis, Melanie Klein's work, and to focus on in a bit of detail on the sort of the key ideas in Klein's psychoanalysis, and then to see if that can help us to say something a bit beyond this the sadism of penality, and wonder about other motivations going on in punishment and in the history of punishment, at least in the context of England and Wales, that are more connected to a different kind of anxiety and a different kind of pleasure than the Nietzschean sadism and the Freudian fear of the punitive superego. So let's start with Klein's work, and for those who I don't know, some people probably will be familiar with Klein's ideas. And I'm just going to try to put things very simply, I suppose. Klein takes the Freudian picture, the Freudian story about the sadism and the paranoia of the superego, and resituates that model of punitiveness and the retributive attitudes that are underpinned by that sort of this cruel Kantian superego. Klein accepts that that's certainly going on in the development of the individual, but she makes two moves. Firstly, she says that actually that's going on a lot earlier than the Freudian story suggests, and she says that that's not the only thing going on in what we call the superego. So here's her story about the early development of this sort of Freudian kind of thing, which she calls, so the first stage of infantile development Klein calls rather, she's got away with names. The first period of the darling infant, Her Majesty the Baby's development, Klein calls the paranoid schizoid position. And at this first stage, she thinks that the infant is introjecting terrifying, persecuting figures that populate the world for them, which are there because of the projection of the infant's own rage, which is basically a source of massive anxiety. And at such an early stage where the ego is basically, she thinks there is an ego, but it's got nothing, no resources available to it. Projection is basically the only recourse for coping with this anxiety. And projection in this sense is the sense of simple projection. There's a number of different sorts of projection, I think, in psychoanalytic thinking and in reality. But the simple sort of projection is the one where you might find that you think that you've got it in your head that there's somebody, that this person, they really don't like you. And then you might find out that actually they've got nothing particularly against you, and that it was really that you didn't like them for some reason. And it was easier to deal with it that way. But that's not a conscious move, of course. It's an unconscious automatic fantasy operation. It's an operation of fantasy, and very primitive. And so the infant is projecting in this sort of way all this hostility, which Klein thinks is just kind of fundamental. She calls it the death drive, following Freud. I don't think that we need to buy into that bit really, but the infant is now introjecting hostile figures, the product of her own projection, and filling up themselves with hostile persecuting figures. In the fantasies of introjecting, the fantasy of introjection is that the infant fantasizes something coming inside them and then existing within them. And these introjections build up what Klein calls an internal world of a world of internal objects, which are fantasized to be inside the infant, inside the self, let's say. These fantasies, the introjected fantasies, are primarily attacking fantasies. And this is one thing that I think starts to qualify the Nietzschean. There's something about this Nietzschean story that's really. Do we need to postulate the festival of the sort of Sardian pleasure at causing suffering to explain how how hostility plays such an important role in the early development of the infant? For Klein, no. We can explain this stuff, and sadism may well be a part of it, pleasure of cruelty may well be a part of it, but there's also a big part of it is defensive for Klein. Confronted with these terrible persecuting figures that are now outside, the persecutory, the anxiety, the rage has been projected. The infant's recourse to these persecutors that confront it then are to try and destroy and annihilate or break and damage these persecutors. Now of course, you know, what we're talking about is who are the external persecutors? It's the bad breast, as Klein calls it. Okay, it's the frustrating, the parts of the mother's body. It's the breast that frustrates, and this frustrating now through projection, evil, horrible, persecuting object is something that. What can the infant do? Well, it can bite and rip and tear and try to destroy the thing. And in these nasty, they certainly are sadistic in the sense of, you know, wanting to cause harm. These fantasies then have this introjective quality that the infant is fantasizing, taking in these bad things inside them. So the internal world of the infant at this early stage basically is full of these horrible, broken up, fragmented, evil, poisonous, persecuting figures that have been imagined to be coming inside. There's also the good object, the good breast, and this is the thing that is, the sort of source of hope for the infant at this early stage. But it's so fragile, partly because at this stage the good breast is a very idealised. The good figure is a very idealised, a totally purified figure. So we have an internal world which at this stage is made up of, the main characteristic, the formal characteristic of it, is what Klein calls splitting. It's made up of extremely one-sided figures. Either extremely good ideal figure, which at the same time is very strict and demanding, hard to please, if you like, hard to placate. And these completely bad, horrible persecutors with no value or no goodness in them, they're purely bad. And this one-sidedness to the fantasy world of internal objects that the infant is building up helps to, so it develops in interplay with the external objects, and through the continuing, the spiralling, Klein calls it, this vicious spiralling of introjecting and then projecting out. Now you're filled up with all these bad persecutors, oh, I want to get rid of them. So then we have the projective fantasies. This is a slightly more complex projective fantasy now of getting those bad figures out and often into something else in the world. And then, unfortunately, once they're out, then they're there to be reintrojected. One of the particularly sadistic, especially sadistic fantasies, this perhaps is the Nietzschean aspect of things at this stage, is the fantasies of expelling the bad figures into the mother's body to ruin it and spoil it. These something that Klein associates with envious, and that's a sort of really that side of it is vindictive, if you like. There's a vindictiveness to those fantasies. But there's also, again, a defensive side to those fantasies because they seem to be associated with controlling the bad figures outside. These, putting these parts of oneself into the others, not only to get rid of them, but also somehow to control the object, the external object. So this early persecutory world is comprised of the main anxiety is paranoia for the self from all of these persecutors everywhere. That's so not necessarily so much about the pleasure of causing cruelty as the constant terror of being annihilated oneself, and of course, this is a terrifying world that has been created by the self in a way, and from one's own aggression and from one's own hostility. But still, it leads to a situation of a sense of constant paranoia or insecurity. The splitting, of course, is part of the problem. It's what leads to these very, very bad, absolutely bad figures everywhere. And the defensive strategies are projecting the bad figures out or trying to annihilate them in sadistic attacks. Okay, so that's, and we'll get to the point of how any of this relates to punishments in a minute, but at a certain point, if all goes well, which it doesn't necessarily, then a new realization becomes possible for the infant, which is that these very bad figures and the very good figures are actually part of the same object, the same whole object. The bad breast and the good breast are, there's just one whole person there that is sometimes frustrating and sometimes loved and satisfying. This is, if you like, a metaphysical advance. The acquisition of the category of substance at this stage, if you want to put it in philosophical terms. The acquisition of this new category and of this realization, this is what Klein calls this moment the depressive realization. The depressive moment. Why is it called that? Well, because the initial reaction to this recognition that the bad bits and the good bits are actually part of one whole complex, ambiguous, perhaps messy, but ultimately loved object, are the setting in of a deep remorse, which Klein calls depressive guilt. It's a completely new anxiety situation for the infant. Prior to this stage, anxiety is about the self, basically. It's paranoid. It's that I'm going to be attacked and destroyed by these persecutors. And to the extent that it is for also the good object, it's still, it's not that the anxiety for the good object is really that these persecutors are going to get it, and how do I keep it safe? But the new depressive realization is one in which the infant recognizes that they have been launching all these horrible attacks on the loved object, on the mother. And the dawning sense now that they've, that they're caught up in a kind of spiral or a cycle, a delusional cycle of paranoia and hostility and sadism. Now, the persecutors that the infant has introjected, and the world that seemed to be a world full of inner persecutors, starts to look a little bit different. Those persecutors that were brought inside now seem less like vindictive, horrible, attacking figures, as damaged and broken and harmed and perhaps dead bits and pieces of the good whole object. So that the anxiety situation now is about having destroyed the thing that you loved, having and being filled up instead, not so much with and surrounded by, not so much with evil persecutors as dead and dying, broken and damaged bits of what was once good and valuable. And this is why Klein calls this the depressive stage. The anxiety here is not paranoia, but depression, a sense of everything good having been damaged and broken. And recent work on depression by Ratcliffe, for example. Ratcliffe has a book out the last couple of years, which uses, based on a lot of empirical work he's done with people with depression, but also following this up from he's doing some quite serious phenomenological, philosophical work on the emotional content of depression, and he, I think, has really lent a fair bit of support to the way in which Klein understands depressive anxiety as being rooted in a sense of what he calls objectless guilt, but a kind of pervasive sense of guilt that's not so much relating to anything in the external world as relating to the sense, a sense of the loss of a world as such, the loss of any horizon of possibilities, that everything is so damaged and dead inside that you're not able to see value in yourself or anything you could do. Okay, and then what are the defences in this stage? How long have I been banging on?
You've got 5 minutes.
Right, okay. So the defences at this stage are basically, there's two things that can happen in this position. One is a move from, instead of, you're no longer, the sadistic attacks aren't going to work anymore. Destroying the object is no longer an aim, because the anxiety is completely different now. So what can one do? Instead of retaliating, destroying, well, in the good case, what one can do is, if there's hope for the infant, then fantasies of repairing and restoring the damaged and broken objects come to the fore. and fuel attempts at creativity. And if those fantasies can be carried out and received in the world in a nourishing way, then that can build hope, and that's the beginning of the process of working through the depressive position, as Klein calls it. The other thing that can happen is that you sink into a depression and don't get out of it, and you have a kind of hopelessness. And the other thing that can happen is the manic defense to this situation, which is a sort of weird combination of some persecutory paranoia, but also a kind of denial of one's hopelessness through sort of reparation in overdrive. Manic, slightly omnipotent fantasy of being able to repair everything and there's no problem because I can put everything right, and I'm not worried. I can make everything better and it's not a problem. Okay, so let me just say a few things about, just to finish off, why I think this might be maybe sort of adding something to the Nietzschean Freudian story about criminal punishment. I suppose broadly I want to say that we have, we can see the corporeal, the death penalty and the corporeal penality of this sort of pre-disciplinary period as playing out, expressing or acting out persecutory fantasies. In other words, of expressing an anxiety situation characterized by splitting and characterized by a sense that the only things one can do are to destroy or control. And then, I'm really crudifying the story, simplifying it extremely here, but then we have a sort of 100-year or 80-year or something intermission where actually retributivism was considered to be a ridiculous old-fashioned thing for about 80 years or so, at least in England and Wales, and a treatment model, a social pathology model, the criminology of the late 19th century and the punishment theory, and increasingly the practice was all about how we can see crime as, these people are damaged, they're pathological, this is society's doing. And there was a broader, I think, depressive moment, which is part of the broader depressive moment was about creating a welfare state and recognising that society has hurt, that crime is not necessarily, offenders aren't necessarily these all bad persecutors, they may be damaged and broken bits of an ultimately good whole that can be restored. And then I think, two things happen. The inability of the liberal capitalist community to actually repair and restore the damage, given the constraints of a liberal capitalist community, lead to first a sort of manic moment where the treatment model goes into overdrive, if you like, and leads to this sort of hyper reparative, but also very controlling. There's a controlling side to this manic reparation thing. And all the alleged excesses of the treatment model in the post-war period that led the retributivists to say that the only way we can actually respect people is if we punish them retributively, not if we try to help them. And I think, well, maybe there's a difference between reparation and trying to help people and seeing, the criminal process as treatment or therapy as part of a genuine reparative criminal process, between that and the manic, controlling, hyper-reparative sort of thing that happened there. And then the other thing that can happen is the depressive loss of all hope. When the manic reparation fails, then depression sets in and you get the nothing works period. it seems like there's nothing we can do about crime. Nothing seems to work. This treatment hasn't reduced offending. You still get recidivism, and that really, I think, that sort of depressive moment lays the ground for what in Kleinian terms we could call a regress to the splitting of a persecutory way of understanding things, where rather than face the guilt, the civic guilt of a criminogenic community that creates offenders, that damages people, but is not able to do anything about its own harmful activity through the social injustice and oppression that's endemic to it, the thing to do then is to regress to a splitting attitude where we then see offenders more and more as evil wrongdoers who are maybe rational actors or maybe just have bad characters, but in any case it's less about the social factors and it's more about blaming individuals. And on the other hand, the growth of what we've, over the last sort of 40 years in the English context, the growth of the ontological insecurity. Somebody mentioned Peter Ramsey's book. Enrique's written about this. The spread of, we were talking in the previous session. We were talking about the preventive, increasingly preventive and preemptive nature of contemporary crime control. I think we see there in other words, I suppose the simplistic narrative I'm telling is a regression to the paranoid and splitting fantasies, which are more primitive, archaic, and ultimately psychotic forms of mental functioning. But that's not the only thing we see in the history of penality. I think there was a period of repeated and failed attempts to work through a depressive moment of sort of remorse and reparation, and that maybe at some point there would be a possibility to take that sort of challenge seriously again.